Hello everyone, my name is Casper. Many years ago I was born in Denmark, but very early on decided I wanted to work in international development. So as a young man I set out into the development world with my wife Aino and our newborn daughter Clara, take up a job for the ILO in Kathmandu, Nepal. Since then I haven't looked back. I've been so fortunate to continue the work for the International Labour Organization. And I've also had the opportunity in the past 20 years of working for the International Finance Corporation, which is a part of the World Bank. Much of my work has been around partnerships and resource mobilization at the international level. And that's what I'm here to share some reflections about today. I should say that for 9 years I worked in the ILO's resource mobilization function, which is a function where we mobilize around 350 to 450 million in voluntary funding every year. When I was working for the International Finance Operation, we mobilized corporately around the same amount, and for the service that I was in, some $150 million every year in funding from many different donors, both public and private. More than that, I have been participating in all international conferences concerning financing for development and conferences concerning sustainable development. And that's essentially what I'll be drawing on in this little piece of reflections that I would like to share with you and further discuss with you today. So, first of all, financing flows have changed, and they've changed dramatically since I started and since what we call official development assistance began. Just consider this. In 1941, there were 19 international organizations. Today, there are more than 350 such organizations, all wanting to contribute to international development. Back then, right after the war, the development assistance and financing from the newly created European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the World Bank Group by far topped all other financing for developing countries. That has completely changed today, because what we have seen is a remarkable growth of the private sector in foreign direct investments, and those flows from sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, investors, private companies, private equity, banks lending have long ago overtaken all of the lending by the World Bank Group and all the international financial institutions combined. It is what has also surpassed official development assistance is debt relief, is remittances from migrants, and illicit flows. So if you add all of these charts, all of these flows onto a chart, official development assistance is just a small little wedge at the bottom. That, of course, raises an almost existential question. What good does official development assistance do? And the holy grail, if I may use that term, of all donor agencies and development cooperation agencies in this world has become, how can we use development assistance resources as a catalyst to mobilize and draw on and bring in, crowd in all of these other financial flows? for the good of sustainable development. And what has happened at the same time is that the world has changed. So when I grew up, it was, to be blunt, relatively simple. Half of the world countries were poor, half of the world countries were rich and gave development assistance. Now the profile of poverty and the global development challenges have changed completely. Now we find pockets of poverty within large middle-income countries that themselves have considerable resources that they can use and draw on to address the problem. So again, the billion-dollar question, as it has been framed, is how can development assistance be used in a catalytic way to free up those resources that these countries in which the majority of the world's poor live can be used for sustainable development. Now, the Financing for Development agenda has been established through a number of major international conferences for financing for development starting in Monterrey. And the last one was in Addis Ababa in 2015, the same year that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was adopted. The Addis Ababa Agenda calls for a much more comprehensive look at how sustainable development is financed. And the specific action areas of this agenda include, first of all, mobilizing domestic public resources. Those resources I mentioned before that middle-income countries, high-income countries, and even low-income countries have access to their own national budgets. The second action area is how to mobilize domestic and international private business and finance. This is the question about how the private sector can be a force for good. And with the private sector, I mean broadly, not just companies, but also investment funds, pension funds, and so on. The third area is international development cooperation. Those donors or development partners, as they now want to be called, who for decades have financed international development and continue to do so. The fourth action area includes international trade as an engine for development. And it's concerning to see how in recent years there's been a backlash against globalization and free trade when we know how free trade has helped lift millions out of poverty. The next action area is debt and debt sustainability. There's been a long focus, particularly in the last 3 decades, on debt relief and how debt relief is an important part of sustainable development because it will free up resources that countries otherwise had to pay in servicing their debt and devote that to development, sustainable development. The sixth area is a vaguer one, but perhaps the most important one, which is called addressing systemic issues. We don't live in an equal world, as is no surprise to you. It's beset by geopolitics, barriers to trade, barriers to technological transfer. And if those systemic issues are not addressed, it'll be very difficult to see how the world can achieve the sustainable development goals. Finally, and I think it's a very important part of the debate, is science, technology, innovation, and capacity building. So as you can see, it's a very broad agenda, and I encourage us to heed that in our discussion afterwards about how we can mobilize resources in a more comprehensive and strategic way. There are some other things that have happened which started with the Paris Declaration for Aid Effectiveness. It essentially said that the days of tied donor support for specific projects is over. That these projects where the donors say to a country or to an organization, I will give you so much, but you have to purchase the goods or the technology in my country and you have to hire compatriots for the project posts. Those days should be over. It said that development cooperation aid, to be effective, was an effectiveness agenda, have to be used and coordinated in much, much better ways. So it was about that time that the whole notion of direct budget support began. And in countries like Tanzania, the most advanced donors actually, instead of funding projects or programs, decided to give extra budgetary support directly to the budgets of these countries. But of course, they demanded a very strong auditing and oversight of how these resources were spent. Around the same time, the UN started to think about, well, how do we move away from tens of thousands of fragmented projects all over the globe and move towards a more strategic and coherent approach? And the UN developed what is called the multi-donor or multi-partner trust funds, and has actively begun asking donors that finance the UN to put a lot of resources into such basket funds or trust funds, where the funding of the donors in the past gave to individual projects could be mingled, shared, and leveraged for a broader impact and better results. This will continue, I have no doubt, but I'm concerned because donors are now no longer talking about partnership and effectiveness. They're talking about smart partnerships. And by that, they really mean you are smart if we do a partnership with you and you hire our nationals or you use our resources. So I'm afraid these things go around in cycles, that to some extent we are back in the 50s and 60s where everything was tied aid for project financing. There seems to be a trend going that way. And that's worrying because we have 1 decade, 10 years to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal. The Secretary General has launched the Decade of Action, and 10 years is all we have. And ODA is stagnating. Trade is projected to drop by between 10 and 30% because of COVID. In fact, COVID is compounding the challenges that we are faced with, because it puts a brake and has put a brake on economic growth. So there are less domestic resources. And with less domestic resources, with businesses not getting the returns that they normally get, holding back investment decisions, with ODA stagnating, with free trade unraveling, with debt growing, we're in a very, very difficult situation. So what to do? Well, first of all, I would like to hear your views. We've already heard from other presenters, and I'm sure we'll have an excellent debate. But for me, it starts with a vision and then with a strategy. So in the ILO, we deliberately wanted to move away from project by project financing. And we didn't stop it outright, but each time we had conversations with donors, we tried to move them towards at least a more programmatic approach. And we tried to convince donors to enter into multi-year, longer-term funding partnerships with us. And we also created a new facility for untied, non-earmarked funding into what we call an extra budgetary financing facility, where the ILO, where we could decide how to allocate these resources for the goals and priorities that were most important for our organization. Then we continued to develop our offering and to demonstrate our continued relevance to attaining the most important goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. And we put an emphasis on 2 things, innovation and communication, which is absolutely key. But at the end of the day, fundraising or resource mobilization is an art and not a science. It's about the human touch. And as with any relationship or partnership, it's about a deep respect for the representatives of the donors and development partners we work with, and building networks and those conversations, and on that trust and experience over time, we have been able to expand our partnership base, to have meaningful discussions with our donors when they're scraping the bottom of their piggy banks and when our budgets are hurting. And with those human relationships, that joint vision, the innovation and a strategic approach can go a long, long, long way. Thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to our discussion.